Good afternoon, everyone. This week we're talking about the juvenile justice system and mental illness with juveniles. I will also, since this is a recording with this PowerPoint, it's not uploaded, I will upload the PowerPoint for you to view as well. Let's get started. So what we're talking about, there's over 2 million youth arrested each year in the United States with a mental illness. Juveniles are sentenced to confinement in order to receive mental health services in many jurisdictions. Gender influences the court on sentencing, especially females with a mental illness. Oops. So how do we address these problems? The presence of mental illness in delinquent juveniles affects whether or not they're likely to receive confinement as a sentencing outcome. Gender has any additional effect on sentences of confinement for delinquent juveniles with a mental disorder. So we will talk about the difference in sentencing for males and females. Juveniles receive confinement in order to receive the necessary mental health services. As I said, I have seen it personally where juveniles needed mental health services and they wanted to stay in the community, but their parents couldn't afford or they couldn't locate the type of services. So they would actually request confinement, and we would see it within the court system where they weren't getting the treatment that they were ordered to receive, and the parents would basically just kind of give up and say, we can't do anything, and so the state would then take custody of the child. Separate juvenile court was designed in 1899 in Cook County. Juvenile court was originally designed to be a parens patriae, which is to protect the child in place of parents who either could not offer appropriate guidance or who were unwilling. And this parens patriae really refers to anyone, not just children, who cannot get the help they need. The purpose of the separate juvenile court was rehabilitation, to supervise and redirect away from punishment, reduce the risk to reoffend, and emphasize treatment. The original purpose. Society has seen a widespread rejection of rehabilitation. So the purpose of confinement now is to restrict the freedom of the offender while simultaneously controlling towards the primary goals of discipline, security, control, and punishment. That's the purpose of confinement for juveniles and adults. Placement in a correctional or residential facility or detention center following adjudication of the court. Placement in detention awaiting adjudication of the court. And placement in detention following arrest. Those are the confinements that we see, especially in the juvenile system. What are some statistics? In the 1900s, there were approximately 50% of youth adjudicated by the courts. They were held in some type of detention facility or jail. The conditions were horrible. By the 1960s, there were 409,000 juveniles incarcerated in jails or detention homes, meaning the types of homes that are locked down. There are more penal outcomes offering neither therapy or justice, and 20% of juveniles are sentenced to confinement. These outcomes do not follow the proposals of the Federal Juvenile Delinquency Act of 1974. Of the 2 million adolescents arrested under the age of 18, there's over 100,000 of those that are placed in a correctional or detention facility. Juveniles' behavior becomes worse following incarceration. We've talked about this before. When we talked about even adults with mental illness being adjudicated, being incarcerated, how their symptoms are exacerbated following incarceration. It's even more drastic with juveniles. Placement within an institution increases the rate of recidivism in regards to high-risk offenders, and in fact, research indicates that the incarceration raised the level of offending in those juveniles with the lowest offending level. So placing any juvenile in an institution will increase their risk at recidivism. Over 50%, over 50% of committed youth released from state incarceration are rearrested. That's a 50% recidivism rate. Nearly 60% of youth with prior offenses return to juvenile court before they turn 18. And increasing the length of sentence does not reduce recidivism, but can actually increase recidivism. So research shows the system is not properly responding to the trauma on the youth in our juvenile justice system. Many of you discussed this within your discussion this week. So youth in corrections face many challenges. They have the separation from families, separation from communities. They face the challenge of education, the pro-social networks that they are in so demand for their maturity, enhances or re-traumatizes those that have been affected by trauma, addressing trauma essentially to the well-being youth, family, and community. And it leaves many of these young people without services or treatment, thus increasing their risk for recidivism and further involvement within the juvenile system and the adult system. According to the Justice Policy Institute in 2010, on the report on healing invisible wounds, any number of factors can contribute to a person being involved in the criminal justice system, including trauma or victimization, especially trauma and victimization. Over 93,000 children are currently locked up in juvenile correctional facilities in the U.S. Research shows that between 75 and 90% entering the juvenile justice system annually have experienced some degree of trauma. Review that again. Between 75 and 93% have experienced some kind of trauma. Childhood trauma becomes a pressing public concern. A traumatic event can involve many types of events, interpersonal events, such as physical, sexual abuse, war, community violence. When I say war, not that the children are at war with anyone, but it's during the time of war. Community violence, neglect, maltreatment, loss of a caregiver, secondary witness to violence, and injuries such as life-threatening illnesses, accidents that can come from physical or sexual abuse. Let me go back to that too. Also, when I was saying that a life-threatening illness, they could experience trauma from being in a car accident. They could be any type of physical accident. They could experience trauma. There's a case that was shown that a child playing baseball was hit in the head with a baseball, and after that began acting out violently. So we're talking about any type of illness. One of the most costly public health problems in the U.S. is our child maltreatment. 14 to 34% of children have experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. Children are twice as likely as adults to be the victims of serious violence, 3 times as likely to experience a simple assault. 13.4% of female adolescents report sexual assault. 35 to 46% of adolescents report witnessing some type of violence, and youth of color are more likely to experience violence than their white counterparts. When we say youth of color, we're talking about African Americans, Hispanics, any of those that are non-white within this statistic. Developing brains are very sensitive to traumatic stress. That's why it's so imperative when we're talking about children and adolescents. Their brain is still developing, and in fact, male brains don't fully develop until 25, 26 years old. The way in which a brain develops and their brain structures regulate emotions, memory, behavior is affected. Some of these structures are measurably smaller in abuse survivors, and with adequate emotional control, the following irregular brain activity can produce the following: failure to develop empathy, more prone to aggressive, violent, and sociopathic behavior. This all ties into traumatic brain injuries as well, which we'll talk about shortly. if any of you, I'm sure everyone's had theory, and within your theory classes and even with your undergrad, you talk about the theory of attachment with Gottfredson and Hershey. And so attachment is very important to the development of an adolescent. So placing a juvenile outside of the community and into a correctional environment severs their emotional ties to their community, their parents, family, and peers, all that they need to mature and develop. Attachment to a primary caregiver, to the parents, family, peers, school, helps the social bonds that juveniles must possess to reduce their risk at offending behavior. Attachment increases an individual's sensitivity to the feelings of others. That's what we were just talking about a minute ago, that lack of empathy. So attachment increases their empathy. The family bond can be achieved with either the biological family or an alternative community-identified family. So when we're talking about attachment disorder and attachment theory, we're talking about a child developing a positive attachment with anyone within a guidance role. So it does any guardian, anyone that they can look up to and feel that mentorship. So just a little recap on what we've talked about so far. Juveniles can actually learn how to be better criminals after detention, incarceration, and especially when they are waived to adult court and forced to serve with adults. Incarceration increases the risk to reoffend and does not deter crime. Incarceration severs emotional ties with the family. Welch-Brewer et al. In 2011 found that mental illness was a key correlate of delinquent behavior for male and female juveniles. There are as many as 2/3 of the youth in institutions and half of all youth on probation met the criteria for a serious emotional disorder. So look at that. Look at those high percentages of these youth that have been institutionalized or been in a detention facility. Of all juveniles arrested, between 50 and 75% met the criteria for a mental health disorder. 1 out of every 5 youth involved in the juvenile justice system has a serious mental health problem. 1 in every 5 involved in the juvenile justice system. And we're not saying just those that are incarcerated, but those that enter the system in any way. Most literature on mental health courts. As of 2006, most of the literature on mental health courts has focused on adult courts and has consisted primarily of either descriptive studies, process evaluations, or policy papers. Despite this efforts, very little is known about their impact on offenders, the community, or the justice and treatment systems. With respect to juvenile mental health courts, even less is known. The National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, the NCMHJJ, you like that long one? Through funding from John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, they undertook a preliminary investigation of existing juvenile mental health courts. And the goal of this effort was to learn more about the juvenile mental health courts currently in operation in this country, and as well to better understand the key characteristics and the target population. The first step in the process involved the development of a list of all the possible juvenile mental health courts that existed. This list was developed through discussions with key mental health and juvenile justice agencies and individuals nationwide. The process resulted in the identification of 11 juvenile mental health courts that were currently operating throughout the nation. These courts were contacted to confirm that a juvenile mental health court was in fact in operation. Through surveys, telephone interviews, and site visits, the NCMHJJ was able to obtain information from 10 of the currently operating courts. The results of the study are presented within that article that I have uploaded within the unit. In addition to that information, the United States General Accounting Office reported in 2001 that over 9,000 juveniles from 33 counties were placed into the system in order to receive mental health services. Remember, I brought that up a few slides ago when I talked about that many juveniles are placed in incarceration and placed into custody of the state in order to get those mental health services. 36% of families who have children with severe mental illness said that their children were in the juvenile justice system just because of the unavailability of mental health care services within their community. And I will tell you, I have witnessed this myself personally, working with juveniles. Mental illness for a juvenile impacts their adjudicatory process. The juvenile may not be fully aware of the juvenile justice process, just as we talked about earlier with adults and not being able to stand trial. The same thing applies for juveniles. Juveniles many times cannot make informed decisions regarding their defense or the potential outcomes. This is not just those that have a mental illness. This occurs with juveniles across the board just because of their maturity, their development, where they are. But remember that when someone has a mental illness, that capacity is lowered. So the fact that they're trying to help with their defense, they can't when they're suffering from a mental illness. And therefore, their sentencing could be increased because their behavior may not show as empathy within the court system. As we talked about before with adults and the screening process, and many of you talked about this within your discussions, the importance of that mental health screening for adults before incarceration. And children are rarely screened. Of the millions of youth who come into contact with the juvenile justice system every year, and the thousands who will enter correctional facilities, few will be screened for trauma-related symptoms or provided with trauma-informed care at their point of entry into the system. So they're not screened for trauma, and they're not screened for mental illness. Evidence gathered through focus groups within the juvenile justice system and family court judges suggest current scientific information has not permeated the justice system. If aware, report feeling overwhelmed with no EVB community services. Additionally, behavioral responses to trauma often resemble those of delinquent youth and therefore are under-identified. As I said, the children who experience trauma have a disproportionate contact with the juvenile justice system. Trauma can be viewed as a specific risk factor for further incarceration. Children are exposed to violence, grow up with a greater risk of victimization, or engage in violence themselves. More youth are at risk to engage in serious crime as youth and as adults. And we'll see this a lot when we look at statistics, that they might be children are at risk impacts them as adults and not just as youth. They may not offend as a youth, as a adolescent or as a youth, but might aggravate to more violence and acting out when they become an adult. There are a number of studies that support the high prevalence of trauma and justice involvement and support the high prevalence of mental illness related to traumatic histories. So a child that experiences trauma within their childhood and adolescence, it can increase their risk of a mental illness. Failure to provide trauma-informed or trauma-based services include the lack of clinical resources, under-identification of trauma symptoms, resources put into management of behavior versus the treatment and the root cause of focus. If in adult facilities, little age-appropriate access to treatment. What I'm saying is there is little access to treatment that is age appropriate for juveniles, especially if they are sentenced to an adult facility. But what I wanted to point out here is that, as I said before, this ties in with what we said about being incarcerated to get mental health, that many times their mental illness is exasperated, is exemplified within their delinquent behaviors, and therefore the court system reacts to those behaviors and not the cause of the behaviors that could be trauma-based or mental illness-based. The most commonly diagnosis for juveniles is substance abuse disorders, clinical depression, disruptive behavior disorders such as conduct disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity, and oppositional defiance. The more common diagnosis is panic and generalized anxiety, bipolar disorder, major depression, disruptive behavior disorders, as I mentioned above, and post-traumatic stress disorders. Schizophrenia is also high among delinquent juveniles. The CDC Children and Adolescents Greater Risk TBI than adults found that the highest risk between 0 and 4 and 15 and 19 years old. The physical consequences are hearing, speech, vision, and coordination struggles. The cognitive consequences are perception, communication, reasoning, judgment, and the behavioral would be mood swings, anxiety, difficulty with emotional control, and anger management. Imagine a juvenile that is, or a youth that is experiencing any of these consequences. How are they going to participate within their own defense in the court system? How are they going to be able to provide their attorneys, provide their caseworkers with the information they need if they're suffering from one of these consequences? As we talked about earlier about the importance of receiving trauma-based treatment and how trauma impacts incarceration, for youths who have experienced trauma, the process of arrest and incarceration itself presents a traumatic event. It can exacerbate their symptoms of mental ill disorders, including resulting in PTSD. The act of processing use, like searches, handcuffs. In Florida, they shackle both hands and feet for juveniles. The isolation and restraint and the risk of abuse by staff all increase the traumatic events on juveniles, especially on juveniles. Gender, mental illness, and sentencing. Juveniles with a mental illness deteriorate further in confinement. As we've said, the failed treatment options equal 30% more likely to receive harsher dispositions, and they receive a heightened sense of trauma. Interrupt current therapeutic services from the community. If a child or an adolescent is involved in the community services, if they're lucky enough to have that available, if they are taken away from that community and incarcerated, it interrupts their therapeutic services. So basically, they could be starting over again once they're incarcerated. And it violates that trust that is built between the therapist and the client, which, especially with juveniles, and I've seen this personally, it is imperative for a success with the juvenile. They have to feel trust of that therapist. And it takes longer for a child to develop that than it does an adult. Recent research findings have found that large-scale study in Finland found an increased incidence of delinquency among youth who had experienced a traumatic brain injury prior to the age of 14. There was a Missouri study of youth in juvenile detention facilities that found a high prevalence of traumatic brain disorder, traumatic brain. Based on the above, justice policy recommends physical brain trauma screening in addition to psychosocial trauma screening. Here we go back to recommending the screenings for juveniles that they are not receiving. There is not equal sentencing among males and female juvenile offenders. I'm sure you've seen this within your theory classes and within juvenile justice classes. If you take the juvenile justice class that I'm teaching, we'll talk a lot more about this in that class. Juvenile males commit more offenses than females. The rate of crime for females actually is increasing. We'll talk about this more in another class, but the reason that this is because it's not necessary that females are committing more crime. It's just that the court systems are looking at them more equally than prior years. The number of females in confined settings is less than that of males. Females spend more time in confinement than males. Females are more likely referred for mental health services. Females are misdiagnosed, more difficult, and less amenable to treatment. It is, when I worked with juveniles and my experience with females, females are much tougher in treatment settings and incarceration, or just dealing with females over males. And females are convicted more than males for violent crimes. This is because what you see is it exasperates with a female. She's more apt to commit a much more violent offense than a male. He might start off with simple assaults, more aggravated assaults, and then continue to build towards a more violent outcome, whereas a female holds in her emotions for a lot longer, and then just blows up at the end, committing a violent offense. Females have a higher rate of mental illness. We'll also see that they're diagnosed differently. They're more likely diagnosed with a conduct disorder for the same acts, and more males meet the criteria for conduct disorder. Mental health and delinquency are related with both males and females, but females resulted in a strong correlation between mental health and delinquency. 80% of females compared to 67% of males have the number one disorder. 74% of females compared to 55% of males in 2011. Major depression, 29% of females compared to 11% of males. And with ADHD, 19% of females compared to 12% of males. We've talked about this more, we're going to talk about this with mental health courts with adults later on in the class. As we mentioned a minute ago, that the processes for juveniles is lacking. It's the same with the mental health courts. The first juvenile mental health court was in February of 2001 in Santa Clara County, California. There have been 10 additional courts have been established, as I mentioned earlier, with in that study. The NCMHJJ learned of approximately 20 additional jurisdictions that have indicated they are either considering or planning a juvenile mental health court. Typically, these courts were initiated by a juvenile court judge or a key politician. As we talked about with the adult mental health court, it was initiated by a judge. There's a large number of youth with mental health needs that are entering the juvenile justice system that need to be redirected to a juvenile mental health court. Lack of services are available to meet their need. These mental health courts provide services to participating youth through formal linkages with existing community-based mental health. Let me repeat that again in more depth. Most juvenile mental health courts provide services to participating youth through formal linkages with existing community-based mental health service providers. As a result, the services available to youth are largely determined by the availability of the services already within the community. Typical services provided to a youth participating in a juvenile mental health court include traditional mental health services such as individual, group, and family therapy, medications and medication management, as well as case management services. A few of the courts make evidence-based services available to participating youth. An example is in King County, Washington, and Seneca County, Ohio, provide multi-systematic therapy to youth participating within the programs. Okay, let me go back a second. A few more facts that were included within one of those articles. Most juvenile mental health courts are administered by the juvenile court. Several courts are administered by the probation department, and one reported that administration of the court was the responsibility of a state family services agency. The fact that cannot agree on who is initiating or who is administering the mental health court causes a lack of services. The courts operate as a separate docket from the regular juvenile court processing and are typically overseen by a single judge. And this follows what I told you, what I was talking about with the adult mental health courts too. Most of the funding for juvenile mental health courts relies on multiple sources, including private foundation grants, federal and state dollars, private health insurance, reimbursement. And some courts are completely supported through existing juvenile court resources and the cost saving that result from a fewer out-of-home placements. Remember, as we said, if we can get someone with a mental illness treatment within the community, it's saving money and it's saving the numbers of incarceration. While some juvenile mental health courts maintain small caseloads, they're usually less than 10. Other courts are able to serve up to 75 youth at any one time. The size of the docket is determined by a variety of factors such as the size of the community, the amount of resources available, and whether the court provides the services directly or relies on existing providers to join in. In terms of offense eligibility criteria for juveniles, most courts accept youth with a wide range of charges, from misdemeanors to felonies. As opposed to adult mental health courts, many do not serve those that have committed felonies. Most of the courts reported have no formal exclusion criteria with respect to current charges, although some do not accept youth with certain charges like gang involvement and some very serious violent offenses. In terms of mental health eligibility, the criteria is more restricted. Almost half of the courts reported restricting eligibility to youth with the most serious mental illnesses, while others accept youth with any identified mental health disorder or issue. So it just depends on the courts themselves and what they have defined as a serious mental illness. Remember, we talked about this with definitions, how those can differ so much. In summary of what we just talked about, I want you to remember these facts, and these are the most important with which I want you to leave from this unit, that incarceration, especially for juveniles, leads to an increase in offending. The mental illness leads to an increase in offending. So confinement causes a further deterioration of mental illness, which results then in an increase in offending. In a sentence to confinement to receive services because they can't receive them in the community, judges do not have all the information related to a child with a mental illness, that they're not being told. The child has not been screened, the adolescent has not been screened, so the judges don't have everything they need to make an informed decision. And the sentencing is unequal for females compared to males with a mental illness. Needed improvements. As we know, more mental health courts are needed, as well as an early identification of mental illness so that the proper services can be identified, early prevention to address the mental health needs, and the parents and community attentive to identify mental health needs, which is very difficult for parents, as I said before, and the community and law enforcement. They will many times label deviant behavior as delinquent behavior and not necessarily a result of a mental illness. Community treatment versus confinement for treatment, and to control the environment for juveniles, control mental illness. As we say, and many of you say in your discussions, this comes with more funding, more education, more training. We need more focused cognitive behavioral trauma therapy. According to SAMHSA, evidence-based trauma-informed treatment should be offered. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is recommended for adolescents to be effective, and therapy must be highly individualized, needs to be gender-specific and culturally sensitive. Enhanced training police officers in trauma-sensitive skills, encounters and arrest methods. As we talked about before, we have those special enhanced police officers that know how to respond to a mental illness. The same is imperative with juveniles. We need to look at least restrictive placements, alternative to incarceration whenever it's appropriate, Remember, we talked about that before, that we're always looking for that least restrictive environment. Need to use a minimal use of seclusion and restraints. Again, those will just exacerbate a mental illness. Juvenile facilities must meet rigorous health and safety standards. Never place juveniles in adult facilities not equipped to ensure health and safety of the youth. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about with when we talk about waiving our juveniles to adults, especially those that have a mental illness. So when you have a juvenile that's committed even a violent offense, or an adult sent to adult court, they still need to be screened, and they need to be placed in a facility that can help with their mental illness. According to the RAND Corporation, comparing the cost of early childhood interventions to benefit childhood interventions to benefits far outweigh the cost. An example, the child abuse programs save an estimated $3 for every dollar spent. The actual cost benefit may not be obvious or quantifiable due to collateral exponential cost. And I posted that within this unit about the RAND Corporation. They do a lot of research on mental illness. And so if you want to read more, do a Google search on the RAND Corporation. And the Pew Center, they have it as well. So finally, I want you to take away from this and remember that juveniles with a mental illness who have committed delinquent behaviors are being removed from their familiar environment and placed into facilities that cannot properly treat them. And therefore, incarceration cannot reduce the risk of recidivism for these juveniles and cannot increase public safety. Incarcerating a juvenile with mental illness will exacerbate it, will increase their recidivism. And remember, as I said, when we remove a juvenile from the community where they're already receiving services, it's going to exacerbate their symptoms, their diagnosis, and cause them many times to go backwards.